Police spent much of the day meticulously investigating the crime scene.
When the police were there, they saw a cut screen in the garage, which seems to indicate that someone cut the screen from the outside, stepped through the screen, and headed for the main part of the house. And they found bloody footprints on the kitchen floor, broken glass, bloody fingerprints, and blood everywhere.
It's Sully, Jones, and Johnson, and this is Kitchen Table Research, where we do the research so you don't have to. And trust me, we have done a lot of research for this case. Speaking of that, we have an extensive library of evidence, photos, and information all located on our Instagram account, Facebook account, and of course our website. You can find the link to our website in our Instagram and Facebook bios. If you want to rate, review, and subscribe to KTR, please go ahead and do that. It helps us track our statistics a little bit better. And if you do that, send us an email and I'll send you something special out of my spooky collection. If you want to reach out to our email, it is kitchen.table.research@gmail.com. We just want to say thanks to all of our fans out there. It seems we are growing, and we're happy to be in your ears today with another episode of Darlie. Finally.
It is finally. It
is finally. And our Darlie episode, the first episode, is by far our most downloaded episode. And I think the reason that a lot of podcasts have not tackled this case is because the evidence and the information that is out there is so much, and it's so convoluted. And of course, we have a woman sitting on death row. And it's a very hard case to wrap your head around. We have been studying this case for over a year. We're thinking about writing a book on it at this point. But we have, when we say we've done the research on this, we have done the research. And we might bust some myths that are out there about this case. And we are really going to try to stick to the facts. You guys already know that we are slightly biased for Darlie being innocent, but we are going to try and present this information to you guys today in a most unbiased way. That way you guys can make up your own decision. These are super heavy researched episodes. It's going to get a little wordy. We're going to take some breaks and give you guys some fun facts while we do that. Unfortunately, Johnson is not with us today. You guys know that she's in school and she's keeping up with our social media, so she might jump in and out of some of our episodes. On that note, let's go ahead and get started. Jones is going to go ahead and remind you guys and wrap up our last episode, and she is going to get us started into today's episode. So why don't you go ahead, Jones?
All right. Well, I'm glad to be here. Sully is right. I have learned more legalese than I thought I ever wanted to. I considered going back to law school. I considered becoming a court reporter. Welcome to part 2 of the Darlie Routier case. In the last episode, we talked about Darlie's background, her marriage to Darren Routier, the birth of her 3 children, Devin, Damon, and Drake. The family had opened their tech business, which provided them with good income. Had a boat, a Jaguar, a Redwood Spa, and a pretty nice house in Rowlett near Lake Ray Hubbard. We spoke about Darlie's journal entry after her last son, Drake, was born, and her short-lived suicidal ideation. We finished with the crime, which led to the deaths of the 2 older boys, Devin and Damon, and a serious neck and arm wound on Darlie. We reenacted the 911 call and finished with Darlie being admitted into the ER, and we spoke about the burial of the 2 Routier boys. Today, we're going to pick up from Darlie's arrest and bring you through the events that led up to her trial. Today, we will begin trying her ourselves, as if Darlie is sitting in the courtroom today with all the new evidence and information that has come out since her trial. We're going to combine evidence and testimony from the original trial, allude to the mistrials and appeals, which we're going to get into in episode 3, and information that came out years later to try and give you a comprehensive understanding on what happened on June 6, 1996, and where that case stands today. We're going to do some play acting. Sully's going to prosecute Darlie. I'm going to defend Darlie, and I'm going to narrate. This episode will be split into parts because it is just so much information. In the final parts of this series, we're going to discuss alternative theories, profiles, and leads the police failed to investigate, as well as any conspiracy theories. So stay tuned and get ready to learn some legalese because it is now judgment time.
All right, I am going to pick up from her arrest to trial. So it was about 6 months from the time that she was arrested until she went to trial. So let's talk about what happened in those 6 months. On June 18th, which is only 12 days after the murders, Darlie and Darren were asked to return to the police station to give personal statements. The two were separated for 3 hours, and by the end of that, Darlie was arrested. She was strip searched, and she spent 2 days naked in a holding cell. That is correct. We have double confirmed that. Mama Darlie and the rest of the family were shocked to hear about Darlie's arrest on the news. Darren was equally as stunned. Darlie was originally indicted on 2 counts of capital murder for Devin and Damon's deaths. In the state of Texas, the murder of a child 5 or younger is automatic grounds for a capital murder charge, meaning Darlie could be sentenced to death row. The state of Texas would eventually drop the murder charge for the older child, Devin, who was 6, in case she was found not guilty in the first trial. They could then retry her for first-degree murder in the death of Darlie Routier. Unfortunately, the Routiers did not hire a private attorney initially. Darlie and Darren's close friends and some family immediately advised the Routiers to hire a criminal defense attorney. However, the Routiers could, quote, not afford one, and were quoted as saying, innocent people don't hire attorneys. So Darlie is awaiting trial. She asks, which is her right in this country, for a quote-unquote speedy trial. So that would be set for 6 months from her arrest. She believed she was innocent, and I believe that is why she asked for a speedy trial. I think she thought there's no way they're going to find me guilty, and I don't want to sit in prison long for years. Her bond was set at $500,000, so $500,000, making her bail $50,000, which the family could, quote, not afford at the time. So whenever you make a bail, you typically go to a bondsman, and 10% of the money is needed initially to get the defendant out of jail. So we're not quite sure why Darren didn't sell the boat or the Jaguar or even their house. I mean, this murder had been committed in their house. I don't know why he wanted to keep it, and he did sell the house shortly after the trial. But I'm not quite sure why he didn't do that to get the money to bail Darlie out. And so instead of waiting in prison for her trial, she could wait at home. The Routiers were just very naive, I believe, about the justice and the legal system. You have to remember that they're 26. I mean, they are still young people figuring out life. And as we just discussed, the legal system is extremely difficult to navigate around. We've had to do a lot of research into the legal system just so we can present you with this case. In fact, we believe it did not benefit Darlie at all that she didn't hire private legal representation, and we believe that it really did not benefit her to request a speedy trial. So on June 28th, which is my birthday, the state appointed Doug Parks and Wayne Huff as Darlie's defense team. Parks and Huff hired forensic consultants Terry Labor and Bart Epstein to reconstruct the crime scene. So these consultants had worked together on many murder trials. So these 4 people, the 2 attorneys, Parks and Huff, and the 2 investigators, Labor and Epstein, had worked many cases together. And so both Labor and Epstein concluded that the scene had not been staged by Darlie, which was the prosecution's primary theory. On July 10th, the defense filed for a change of venue to another county in Texas. The defense was expecting the trial to be moved to a county with a larger pool of liberal potential jurors, expecting Dallas to be the venue. The judge that presides over this case, Judge Toll, granted this petition, and the trial was moved to Kerr County instead, which is a predominantly Republican, traditional, and ultra-conservative town with a very small jury pool and a 95% conviction rate in capital cases. In Darlie's pretrial hearing, the second murder charge for Devin was dropped, as we had previously stated. However, the details surrounding Devin's death are discussed heavily in the trial for Damon, because in the pretrial hearing, her original public defense team, Parks and Huff, did not put in a motion for limine. So to put in a motion for limine literally means on the threshold or at the start in Latin. It's a motion made to the court before a jury has been selected in either a civil or a criminal case. Motions in limine ask the court to order the opposing party, its counsel, and witnesses to not talk about or even mention certain facts or evidence in the presence or hearing of the jury. This is from thelegaldictionary.com. The defense also failed to file a motion in limine on 3 more pieces of evidence that should have been held back from the trial. The first was the alleged suicide attempt, because it happened more than 30 days prior to the crime, making it legally irrelevant. The second was the silly string video, which we're going to talk at length about. The third was sex toys that were found in the Routier home. If they had filed a motion for limine and pretrial, which they should have done, they would not have been able to talk about Devin's death, the suicide note, the silly string tape, or the sex toys. Because they didn't file that, all of this comes out in the trial. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to Jones, and she's going to tell you about the judge and what happens next.
So the judge assigned to this case, his name is Judge Mark Tolley, was due to retire effective January 1st, 1997, making Darlie the last case he would preside over, which started January 6th, 1997. Judge Tolley also would die less than 10 years later due to a condition called frontal lobe dementia, and it appears that he may have already been facing some neurological difficulties, and this could have affected his sometimes bizarre behavior. An observer in the courtroom during the trial noted that Judge Tolley took 16 cat naps during the trial. We wonder, why didn't the defense challenge this bizarre behavior? The judge had already shown favor to the prosecution, and his motions and rulings expose his bias against Darlie. Judge Tolley issued a gag order to stop the media frenzy and prevent the family from speaking publicly, but all that did was create even more interest in the case, just like it has in the Idaho 4 and the Delphi murders that we've both recently talked about. However, the media made Darlie out to be guilty in the public eye before she ever stepped foot into a courtroom. On September 20th, Mama Darlie and Darren had been speaking to the media after the gag order was placed. They were ordered to appear before Judge Tolley to answer for their violations. Both claimed they were never informed of the gag order, and they hired an attorney named Doug Mulder, who's a high-profile attorney out of Dallas, who had previously prosecuted 24 inmates to death row as a state prosecutor. He was referred to as Mad Dog Mulder, had opened a private practice and changed sides to be a defense attorney. On October 21st, Mama Darlie and Darren, who had written an affidavit for court approval, they wanted to switch Darlie's defense team to Mad Dog Mulder and Richard Mosty, an attorney from Kerrville. The affidavit states a private agreement that Mulder would not implicate Darren as a suspect. The original defense was going to present and pursue this theory, but Mulder was not interested in pursuing that original team's evidence of forensic investigation that Labor and Epstein had provided. The agreed retainer for Mulder was $95,000, which is a reasonable retainer for a criminal investigation of this caliber. How could they afford Mulder, but not Darlie's bail? And this is only 3 or 4 months later. We're not sure if Darlie was aware and consented to the change in her defense team. We have the affidavits of this change of counsel in our picture section, and it also includes her arrest warrant in the affidavits. We have never been able to find an affidavit where Darlie signed it for change of counsel. You have to assume that's true, or she would have stood up in court and said, who are these people? So it's just be known that we don't know whether she was really part of that decision making.
Yeah, and we've been able, like we said, to find the affidavit where Mama Darlie and Darren signed for Mulder. And this is an affidavit that just simply does not exist to our knowledge. It was never put into discovery in the pretrial. We just can't find it. So we wonder, was she aware that they had changed her counsel? Number one, and number two, if they had done this without her consent or signature, it is actually a grounds for a mistrial. So why don't you go on with the next piece of information?
So the arrest warrant, which was 16 pages long, was public information and was written by the lead detective on Darlie's case, whose name is Jimmy Patterson. We're going to remember Jimmy because his part in this case is suspect. So we're going to be coming back to him later in episodes. Typically, arrest warrants are concise, to the point, and are not a synopsis of the prosecutor's evidence. The warrant's intent is to simply obtain a judge's signature so that the arrest then takes place. A warrant only needs enough information to get the judge to sign the warrant as to why an officer believes someone should be arrested. You don't want to reveal too much, especially because a gag order's been put into place by Judge Tolley. Typically, warrants are a one-page document requiring suspects' identifying information and the judge's signature. Darlie's warrant was 16 pages and written so that it listed evidence that presumed her guilt and outlined points of evidence that presumably pointed to Darlie's guilt, even though it was 6 months before the trial, and there was not the complete evaluation of forensic evidence, even yet. Warrants differ from case to case and state to state, but we believe the warrant is important. We will post Brian Koberger's warrant and Darlie's so our fans can compare the two if this is interesting for y'all.
The next thing we're going to talk about is Darlie's habeas corpus rights and if they were violated, because it kind of goes hand in hand with this arrest warrant. So habeas corpus is a legal action in which a prisoner challenges the authority of the jail or prison to continue holding them. Again, this comes from our legal dictionary. So basically, people have heard you can only be held for 24 hours until they can get an arrest warrant signed on you. So
Right.
If you're being held before an arrest warrant, then your habeas corpus rights have been violated. So my question to you, Jones, we can have a quick chat about this. To me, her arrest warrant, even though it's a little suspect, does state that they have enough proof to take her to trial for a double homicide. So because that arrest warrant has been signed, I feel like her staying in prison during this time while she's waiting for trial doesn't violate her rights because they gave her the chance to be bailed out and the family decided not to do that. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with everything you said. What I think is suspect is the arrest warrant basically gave the public, the media, and the prosecuting attorneys reasons for trial, not necessarily to hold her.
Okay.
And so I don't know whether it's right or wrong. I just wonder whether her habeas corpus rights actually were violated. As we've said, we are by no means legal. but it does seem suspect to me.
Yeah, I agree. And so, for those of you that don't remember the Darlie Routier case, think about it was similar to the curiosity and outrage sparked by the Kaylee Anthony case. And I believe that Casey also spent her time before the trial in jail as well. I believe that.
I think you're right.
Yeah, because I think the Anthonys did not pay her bail if one was set for her. I'm not quite sure if there was one set for her. But I do remember like the videos of them talking through the like plastic barriers while she was being held. Greg Davis, which we're going to get into him in a minute, called Darlie a quote psychotic killer to the media. And we're wondering if this violates the gag order. Another juror is stated as saying, quote, painted fingernails, bleached platinum hair, didn't take her children to church, had triple D breast implants, wore rings on all of her fingers, and spent money on herself. And that is where the juror believed that is where Darlie's guilt lied, summing up basically what the public thought of Darlie and what the media was calling her. And remember, in our last episode, this is coming right after the cases of Diane Downs, Susan Smith. So these mothers killing their children are starting to pop up in the media. And I think, as we talked about in the first episode, that Darlie got caught up in this whirlwind, whether she was guilty or not.
Greg Davis called Darlie a psychotic killer to the media. Let me just back up and say Greg Davis doesn't have the expertise to be able to apply a diagnostic label to Darlie. So when he calls her a psychotic killer, he is way out of line.
And he's breaching the gag order.
Yes.
Don't you agree?
Yeah.
Because he's, like you said, he's diagnosing her when the gag order says, you guys can't be talking about this.
Right.
Especially a diagnosis, you know?
Right. I think that by keeping Darlie locked up, the public perception was, quote, these are my own words, she must be horrible, and we have to keep her locked up so she can't do anything else.
Yeah, I agree. Just like Casey Anthony, although, you know, KTR believes that the Anthony family is responsible for the death of Kaylee. But it is interesting to compare their arrest to trial because a lot of similar things happened, whether they were guilty or innocent.
You are innocent until proven guilty.
And I don't think that happened for Darlie.
I don't either. They immediately convicted her.
Right. Like we said, they convicted her before she ever set foot in a courtroom.
Or she ever set foot in that jail that day to come in and give her a statement. They already knew they planned to arrest her that day.
Well, and I'm wondering, do you think because they kept her naked that they just wanted to eye her? I mean, that's, you know, a lot of people have said it's because she was on suicide watch.
Yeah.
And this was kind of before we really had a plan in place in our prison system for suicide watch. And so now if you go into prison and you're on suicide watch, you still have like a bed, you're still clothed. However, a, security officer is watching you.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there were some good old boy practices put in there where they thought, hey, let's throw her in that cell naked and see,
If that's true, that is the most disgusting thing I've ever heard.
It is. It is. Well, let's change gears for a minute. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Kerrville? You have lived there. Trial venue was changed from Rowlett to Kerr County. I'm going to have Jones fill you in a little bit about Kerrville.
So deer hunting season starts the first of the year. There are white-tailed deer in numbers in our neighborhood. Like, we'll go out for a walk and see 12 deer. I'm pretty sure they're so tame that they eat out of my hand. So it's the start of deer hunting season at the beginning of the trial. Judge Tull and his wife and other attorneys love deer hunting. And now the state would be paying for room and board for all these attorneys and investigators. What a sweet deal. Not only did the prosecution love hunting, but the judge and the attorneys for both sides are all friends, and they shared this love of hunting. So, I'm going to get a little vacay out of this trial.
And just because the prosecution and the defense go at it in the trial room behind closed doors, they're all friends.
Yeah.
I mean, they're going to steak dinners, they're going hunting, they're staying in a nice hotel. We wonder if the change of venue is a little suspect for them to be able to take basically a free hunting trip. Again,
Right.
if this is true, that's disgusting.
Well, that's certainly not kosher, legal, or ethical. I'll say
I
that.
would say that. It's definitely not ethical. Okay, so we are going to read you some opening statements, and this is where things are going to get a little lengthy. So we're going to kind of break it up and tell you about some of the backgrounds of the attorneys that are going to work this case. So I just want you guys to know, what is the purpose of an opening statement? An opening statement informs the jury of what they're going to hear during this case. It is a summary of the evidence and what evidence will prove over the course of the trial in basically a lengthy summary before both sides begin to argue their case. So we have written these opening statements because if you read the 1997 opening statements that the prosecution and defense wrote, neither one of them sum up what they're about to say in this case. The prosecution fails to do several things during the trial. Both do not provide a timeline, a theory of how this crime happened. It's only about 6 or 7 pages. Normally, opening statements can take sometimes days in a courtroom. They're reading these opening statements in like an hour. The prosecution relies on their, quote, expert witnesses, and basically the prosecution's opening statement is just introducing the experts that they are going to put on the stand. While Mad Dog Mulder, our defense, he just kind of seems to hem and haw and not poke any real holes in the prosecution's, well, lack of opening statement. Just like we did kind of in the yogurt shop murders, which if you guys have not gone and listened to those episodes, I think they're one of my favorites. They're the first episodes we did, and they're like one of my favorite episodes. Just like we had written our own timeline and given you our theory past a certain point in that episode, we're going to kind of pick up there and do the same thing. We have written our own opening statements, again, summarizing everything that we know to date on this case. So since I am prosecuting, I'm going to act as Greg Davis and Toby Shook, who prosecuted Darlie Routier. Let me tell you just a little bit about Greg Davis. He is a high-profile prosecuting attorney in the state of Texas. QWTX, which is out of Waco, reported, quote, Davis is said to be the most successful capital murder prosecutor in the state of Texas. However, Davis got in trouble after Darlie's trial for allegations that some of the DA employees were falsifying records. Davis was indicted for tampering with government records, and this included falsifying time cards, working on campaigning on the state of Texas's taxpayer dimes instead of doing that off the clock. And then subsequently, those records were destroyed because of the implication. The indictment was 2 years in prison and up to a $10,000 fine. Greg Davis is kind of in this good old boy system. So he squashed these implications, and because of this network, he has been elected to a new office in another district to this day. Greg would take the lead on the Darlie Routier case, and as far as I know, he still believes that she is guilty. I'm going to go ahead and get into what I think an opening statement should be for this case. Darlie is described by her own best friend, who is Barbara Jovell, as materialistic, a woman who showed off her good life and cared for nothing but her own looks and status. The motive was money. The motive was Darlie. It's all about Darlie. Darlie's bubble had burst. The Routiers were having problems in the home and in their business. Darren had been denied a current bank loan request, and the couple was 2 months behind on their mortgage. The night of the crime, Darren has barely drifted into sleep when he hears glass break and Darlie scream. He throws on some jeans and his glasses before rushing down the stairs to find his family and house covered in blood. No evidence shows an intruder was in the house, and today we must follow that evidence. When Darren went upstairs for the night, Darlie was just getting ready to commit her crime. Darlie's fed up with the debt. She's fed up with Darren and the responsibility of taking care of 3 children. The defendant now has a scene to stage. Darlie takes a bread knife out of her own kitchen and goes outside her back gate, creeping along the pathway, avoiding their security light. She then goes 75 yards down the alley to plant a piece of evidence, which will be a sock. As she returns, she cuts the garage window screen with the bread knife. The defendant would then re-enter the home, put the bread knife back in the knife block, and grab a single-edged butcher knife. The woman you see before you, Darlie Routier, then plunged that knife into her 6-year-old son, Devin, 2 times. She then goes over to her second child, Damon, who is only 5. Darlie stabs and slices Damon over 4 times. The boys' life insurance information are found feet away from the bodies. Darlie stages a struggle. She pushes the glass table and floral arrangement off its base. She throws a wine glass in the kitchen and pushes a vacuum over. It is now only minutes before she'll make her 911 call at 2:30, and evidence will prove that while standing over the kitchen sink, she stabs herself in the arm and then hesitates before slicing her own neck, avoiding all major arteries to make it look like she had been attacked. She then sets the butcher knife on the bar, screams for Darren, and picks up the phone to call 911. While calling 911, Darlie would not perform life-saving measures, according to Waddell, who was first on the scene, or the EMTs that would arrive during the 911 call, as you heard us talk about in episode 1. Darlie's nightshirt is covered with wet blood, and in the right shoulder of that nightshirt are 2 drops of blood from the boys, which proves that she pulled the knife over her head to attack both Devin and Damon. A blonde hair is found on the screen that was cut. No dust has been disturbed around the window the supposed intruder breaks into. EMTs and nurses who worked this crime described Darlie with a flat affect, indifferent to the murders of her 2 sons. In fact, just a week after their deaths, the defendant sprayed silly string and sang happy birthday while vapidly chewing gum in a t-shirt showing off her large fake breasts and, quote, danced on her children's graves to gangster rap. The motive was money. The motive was Darlie. Darlie wanted her lavish life back, and on June 6, 1996, the defendant, Darlie Routier, with premeditation, murdered her 2 sons, Devin and Damon. So that is my opening statement. Typically, the defense, their job is to poke holes in that statement. So before Jones does that, I'm going to tell you about Darlie's other attorney on the case, whose name is Toby Shook. Toby Shook would eventually switch sides as a prosecuting attorney to a defense attorney for the state of Texas. He has been elected the top criminal defense lawyer from 2007 to 2022 by D Magazine, which is like Dallas Magazine. He has tried over 300 defense cases and has won the Lone Star Award and the Super Lawyer Award. Another big case he worked was the Kaufman Texan prosecutor murders, in which he prosecuted and sentenced the perpetrator, Eric Williams, to death. Toby Shook also went to Texas Tech, so go Red Raiders. Toby Shook seems to be the only person to have come out shining after the Darlie Routier case. Jones, what do you think about Darlie's prosecution? Do you think that Toby's, because it's not far after her case, do you think that Toby switched sides because of Darlie, or do you think that most attorneys just start in the prosecution ring and then switch to the defense because the defense is a harder side to try? What are your thoughts there?
My thoughts are that when you graduate from law school, most newbie lawyers go into the DA's office. And I think whatever job is offered to them is the job that they take. They are hungry to get their first job. So, if the DA's office offers Toby Shook prosecution, then he's going to take that.
Yeah.
And when he gets the opportunity and a little seniority, he says, I've always wanted to be on the defense side. And so I have this opportunity and I'm going to change. Do I think Darlie's case influenced him? I think the attorneys that look back over this case, and any attorney that really reads about this case, especially those that were part of the case, her appellate lawyers, anybody that's worked on the case, because this case now spans almost 30 years, has to have been influenced by this case. I think this is probably studied in law school as a case presentation, just like we're trying to do today. And certainly I think that attorneys have been influenced by this case.
It really seems that out of all of the lawyers, and I know that some defense attorneys, you can say what you want about them. Yes, some of them are defending people that have committed serious crimes. But I believe that Toby Shook is kind of our shining star. I think out of all the lawyers, even though he was on the prosecuting side at this time, I agree with you, Jones. I think looking back, I think that he would have done things much differently. But again, he was not the lead attorney. And so he was just starting out. He might not have had a lot to say about how this case went.
Right.
You agree with that? Okay, so before you get into your opening statement, which I'm super excited to hear, why don't you tell us a little bit about the main defense attorney, which is Mad Dog Mulder?
He is a defense attorney. He started out prosecuting. He prosecuted many cases.
I think as we stated, he prosecuted like 24 people to death row. That's a pretty good run as a prosecutor.
Yeah. Now, a couple of people have been exonerated, but, overall, his record's pretty impeccable on prosecution.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, he becomes Routier's defense attorney. I want to talk a little bit about Walker Rayleigh. And, frankly, I can't remember whether this case was before or after Darlie, but for some reason, it was right after Darlie.
I believe it was right after Darlie, yeah.
Walker Rayleigh was a pastor at the leading Dallas-based First United Methodist Church. That was a huge congregation. They were very active in their civic service. Rayleigh was cheating on his wife, and he attacked her in their home garage and left her for dead. He said that she was attacked by a white supremacist who was actually the cheating Rayleigh. That comes out later on. Peggy Rayleigh, the wife that he left for dead, has been put into a nursing home, and she and Walker eventually divorced. She died several years later. Mad Dog Mulder got Rayleigh off for criminal charges, although he did have to pay $18 million. I wonder where he came up with that.
Oh, I wonder. Do you think it came from maybe his large congregation in a megachurch?
I have to question Anna's theory that maybe Mulder was trying one of his first defense cases and was still treading water about what was and wasn't important for the case.
Yeah, I really wonder, not only did he have a good run as a prosecutor, but he has a good run as a defense attorney and has gotten several people off, including Walker Rayleigh. I mean, why did he not get Darlie off? Do you think it was just the timing?
I think it was the timing, and I think that, if you switched sides from defense to prosecution, you kind of have to get up and running to understand all the defense ins and outs. So maybe
Well, he didn't come onto the case until October. So he has October, November, December, and the trial starts January 6th. So he's defending a high profile, basically double homicide in 3 months. I mean, you can't even get DNA testing back in that time, in that amount of time, especially in 1996.
Back in that, I mean, he was unable to get all the results from the DNA testing before they went to trial.
So I want to talk about one more case that he did. Mad Dog also got an A&M student off from stabbing a woman 26 times while he was, I believe, a freshman at A&M University. He only served 3 years in prison. So again, Mad Dog Mulder, he has since passed away, is still looked at as a highly prized attorney. And I have read a few articles where he says that Darlie was his one regret or his one downfall, that he did feel bad that he did not get Miss Routier off. So on that note, why don't you go ahead and start your opening statement for the defense?
So I'm going to be Mad Dog Mulder, and I'm also going to be his assistant, Richard Mosty. The prosecution wants you to believe that Darlie is a materialistic woman who only cares about herself, that she is narcissistic, that she's a psychopath, she's a criminal mastermind, but that is really far from the truth. Her friend, Barb Jovell, is the only friend that's going to testify against Darlie. Just because the Routiers were late on a few bills does not mean it would give Ms. Routier a motive to kill her children. Mrs. Routier is a hardworking mother of three and a devoted wife. She has no history or indications of mental illness, and she has no criminal history. Mrs. Routier often bought gifts for her acquaintances and even paid a mortgage for a friend on hard times. Mrs. Routier's life was full of joy. The Routiers had plans to visit family in Pennsylvania, and family weddings were coming up, including the vow renewal of Darren and Darlie. The Routiers' business had highs and lows, and Darlie and Darren had learned and expected that so they could plan their budget. In 1995, the Routiers claimed $250,000 income at their business. They also had assets they could have sold if they needed extra money. Darren's going to testify to the events of that night. He never thought that Ms. Routier, his wife, was the culprit of the crimes committed against his family. She comes from a good family. She's raising a good family. She's all about family. It is her identity. Her life revolves around the family because that's what she wanted and that's what she chose. There is evidence which we will present that shows an intruder likely entered the home. We know this from forensics. Some of this is going to come out years after her trial, and of course, we'll get into this later episodes. The prosecution fails to ever put a timeline together because you cannot make all the pieces of forensic evidence fit. As Darlie is on the phone with 911 and would not have had the time to be in the alley, to cut the screen, to place the knife, to knock over the glass table before she calls 911. The prosecution doesn't want to present the sock evidence because if she premeditated this crime and she had already stabbed herself, her blood would have been found leading down the alley to that sock evidence. The 911 call alibis her story. The knife evidence and the quote experts that the prosecution speaks of cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mrs. Routier committed this crime. And can you, as a jury, convict a woman to death row on circumstantial evidence? There is no evidence that Darlie left the house. This is why the prosecution neglects to present the timeline. The ME cannot even definitively state that the knife from the knife block is the weapon that killed the boys, nor can the ME corroborate a timeline of how this crime occurred. The prosecution's going to call in their, quote, experts to examine Darlie's clothing and the blood spatter evidence found on the nightshirt Darlie was wearing. The blood splatter evidence in this case is based on old scientific methods. The, quote, experts will fail to provide reasonable doubt, and they provide information that cannot be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, which is also going to be a major contention in this trial. In fact, most of the blood evidence is going to back up Darlie's intruder theory. The scene was highly contaminated from the many first responders and police on the scene. There is no blood splatter evidence showing Darlie threw a wine glass or turned over a vacuum in an attempt to, quote, stage the scene. In fact, the DNA testing proves Darlie's story of the horrific crime that occurred that night. The defense will provide experts that will testify that Darlie could not have self-inflicted the wounds that you can still see today on Darlie's neck. The prosecution, however, wants you to believe Darlie never picked up the knife from the laundry area, that she actually set it on the counter. But blood evidence shows she did, in fact, pick the knife up from the laundry room where the intruder exited. Darlie did what she knew to do as far as life-saving measures go. She immediately dials 911. Prosecution's going to present a witness who will testify that she is in the house the entirety of that call, as will the police officer who arrived less than 2 minutes after the 911 call initiated. Darlie and Darren provided the best life-saving measures they could, given the circumstances of the knife wounds inflicted on both boys and Mrs. Routier herself. Mrs. Routier did the best she could. And remember, Darlie is fighting for her own life and losing blood quickly. Due to the severity of the injuries, the defense believes no matter what life-saving measures could have occurred early on, the result would have been the same, which is the death of Devin and Damon. An expert for the prosecution is also going to testify to blood evidence, and we're going to challenge that because this expert and analyst does not and cannot provide proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The hair that was found at the scene in the garage window does not come back and match Mrs. Routier. Instead, that matches a female police officer. So judgments were made before evidence was confirmed on more than one occasion. Let's talk about Ms. Routier's stay in the hospital. The nurses are going to testify that Ms. Routier seemed unconcerned. She had a flat affect, and what they write in their nurses' notes is higher than what they're going to testify on the stand. Isn't that interesting? The silly string tape has been taken out of context, and when put into the correct context, tells a different story. A story of a mother that's grieving, but she also wanted to celebrate the life of her sons. She also wanted to include the other children and families that they knew that also wanted to mourn the Routier boys. Mrs. Routier has no motive, and the forensics show that an intruder came into the house on June 6, 1996, grabs a weapon, violently attacks this defenseless family. Mrs. Routier is innocent, and the prosecution fails to present evidence that is beyond a reasonable doubt. They fail to provide a timeline, and they fail to uphold the forensic standards needed to put this woman behind bars, leaving her husband, her infant son, and her entire family broken. The defense strongly believes that around 2 a.m., an intruder peers into the living room window. He sees Darlie asleep on the couch. This intruder has been obsessed with Darlie. He's been stalking her, calling her on the phone, and even peering into her garage, according to witnesses. The intruder cannot see the boys from this vantage point because the boys are asleep on the floor. So he doesn't have the angle to be able to see them on the floor. He breaks in, and his motive is rape. And he's surprised when he finds 2 children on the floor in the room. So we've already talked about that he peers through the sliding back door, which is locked, so he can't get in that way. So he slit the window screen into the window that Darren had left open that hot June night in the garage. The intruder begins his attack on Darlie, who defends herself, and the defense wound on her right arm. She receives those bruises on her arms and the defensive wound on her right neck. Unexpectedly, seeing the 2 boys on the floor, the intruder grabs another knife and he stealthily plunges the blade into Devin twice and Damon in 2 separate attacks as they're sleeping. Mrs. Routier is innocent, and the defense is going to prove this time and time again. The prosecution wants you to believe that the petite mother of 3 you see before you today is a psychotic killer. But Darlie Routier is not the coldly brilliant psychopath that the prosecution states. We're going to provide statements from friends and family that know Darlie. She's a generous and loving woman without a mean bone in her body. On June 6, 1996, Mrs. Routier spends the whole day caring for her family and working alongside a woman she had hired to help her do housework. And when night falls, she finds her two older boys on pallets in the living room and decides to sleep on the couch in the living room because she had not been sleeping well with the new baby in the crib in the master bedroom. Evidence is going to show that the state's entire case based on speculation and circumstantial evidence. You would be doing a disservice to the American justice system by sentencing a woman to death on circumstantial evidence. She's a victim, she's bereft, and she is not guilty. Darlie Routier is actually a hero.
Okay, so give us a little bit about her other attorney that was working with Mad Dog Mulder. His name is Richard Mosty.
After this case was over, he decided that he did not want to be a defense lawyer. He quit his job in the I don't know if he was private or part of the DA's office, but he quit his job as a defense attorney. He actually went to work for a bank corporation, and then after a few years decided that he loved defense and went back to work as a defense attorney. So this is one instance where the attorney really seemed to be shaken up by the result of this trial.
I was going to say, do you think that is because of this trial?
Absolutely.
Do you think that he thought that they put an innocent woman in jail?
Yes.
I do too. So let's talk about Judge Tolley. We've talked about him a little bit over this episode. So he presided over this case. We mentioned that he had frontal lobe dementia, which he eventually succumbed to in 2007.
Some of the early symptoms are noticeable 10 years before death. So this certainly could fit into this timeline.
So why don't you, as a nurse practitioner, give us a little information about dementia and what the early signs would be?
It's going to be the same signs as any dementia, okay? But your frontal lobe is kind of where you use your empathy skills.
Yeah.
And so if that frontal lobe was in the beginning stages of being affected by this dementia, then I think it accounts for some of the rulings he made in the case. That is truly a conjecture on my part.
Truly a conjecture. But do you also think that him taking cat naps might have had something to do with it?
Of course.
Yeah, I do too. So let's talk about what happened to Judge Toll's family after he died in 2007. So he has a daughter who's named Jean Marie Geis. She had married a prominent real estate developer, and in December of 2008, she ended up killing her two children at their home in the early morning hours and then committed suicide herself. Initially, her story involved a few days before she commits these murders and suicide. She tries to attack her husband and pretend that she's been kidnapped in this staged kidnapping because her husband was a prominent person. I'm not quite sure where her thinking was there. She says she was kidnapped. She says that she was raped. She was taken by car. And eventually the intruders dropped her back off at her home where her husband Frank had been hit severely with a hammer in the head. So Frank does go to the hospital, and as police begin to investigate this, they're thinking this is super sus. Like, I don't think Jean Marie is telling the truth here. So then a couple of days go by. Her husband Frank is back at the house. He's out of the hospital and he's away from the home. I don't know if he's at work or he got up early to go to the gym, so I'm not quite sure. But he was out of the house that morning. And so Jean Marie decides to kill her two children and commit suicide. So does this ring a bell of familiarity? Do you think that the Darlie Routier case gave her the motive or the idea to commit this crime in this way? Because we're going to find out after the crime, the police find out that she had been cheating on her husband. What do you think, Jones?
You know, new medicine is different in 1997 medicine because the concussion standards for treating a head wound with a blunt object have changed. So back in those days when Frank was hit, the rule was there were minutes, and if you'd been unconscious for
X number of minutes, you couldn't play
in sports. So what surprises me about Frank is that he's hit in the head. He goes to the hospital. He's got, I'm going to assume, a concussion from that deep a head wound.
I believe they do say that he suffered from a pretty severe concussion.
Yeah. And then within a few days, he's back at the gym. That would never happen today in today's medical rules.
Yeah.
Just say.
So do you think that the Darlie Routier case influenced Jean Marine Geis?
Well, I think it certainly sets the story, doesn't it?
I mean, it seems like it's too coincidental for me. So I'm going to say yes.
Yeah.
That was a lot of information for you guys, and this concludes the arrest to trial, the beginning of the court case, and we have introduced you to some of the big players in this complicated shit show of a trial. In the next episode, we will talk about forensics and continue to introduce you to this colorful cast of characters the prosecution will put forth, quote, their experts. So stay tuned for upcoming episodes. Don't forget to check out our website where you can find all things KTR, including pictures for this episode and more. We've also provided maps and other information like the arrest warrants. Also, remember to go like, subscribe, and download episodes, and I will send you a gift. We hope you enjoy your day. We can really tell that our fans are loving some of these series that we're doing. The Murdoch one seemed to go over really well. As I previously stated, Darlie Part 1 is by far our biggest downloaded episode. We will be in your ears soon, continuing with this case. As for now, we are signing off, and we will present our sources for the Darlie episodes at the end of the series. Do you have anything else to say, Jones?
I don't. This is fascinating to me, and I think the trial's going to be even more telling. So I'm anxious to get that podcast out and up and running.
I'm anxious too. So we have built a forensics table, and we are going to go through them one at a time. And that's why we didn't want to try and shove all this information in your ears, because it is so much and so in depth that we really want you guys to think about it as we present the facts and forensics that are attributed to this trial. So again, like I said, we hope you guys have a great day. We hope you stay safe, and we are excited to continue the Darlie episodes.